The afternoon sun was hot for late September. It beat down on the fields by Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, 1066. Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, felt it. His men felt it. They had won a victory at Fulford Gate just 5 days earlier. Now they were waiting for hostages from the city of York. Many of his men had left their mail shirts, their burnies back at the ships at Rickhall, 10 miles away. It was too hot to wear them. They expected a parley, not a battle. And then they saw it, a cloud of dust in the distance. Not a small one, a big one, and beneath it the glint of sun on steel. King Harold Godwinson of England had marched his army 185 miles in 4 days. It was an impossible speed, but here he was. Hardrada's Norse army was caught. They were split on both sides of the River Derwent. They were outnumbered, and many were unarmored. Panic was the easy choice, but they were not easy men. They were the veterans of 100 fights. Hardrada sent a desperate message for his men at the ships to come. Then he began to organize his defense. He needed to buy time. He formed a shield wall. It was not a simple line of men. It was a dense living fortress of wood, steel, and flesh. The men stood shoulder to shoulder. Their round shields overlapped the edge of one, covering the edge of the next. It created a near-solid barrier. From behind the wall, a forest of spear points angled out, ready to receive a charge. Harold Godwinson's army arrived. They saw the Norsemen forming up. The English had cavalry, the housecarls, professional warriors on horseback. They were confident. A charge from heavy horse could break any infantry line. The horns blew. The ground began to shake. Hundreds of English horsemen charged the North shield wall. They crashed into it like a wave against a cliff. The sound was a nightmare of splintering wood, screaming horses, and shouting men. Horses and riders were impaled on the spear points. The front rank of shields absorbed the impact, men bracing with their entire bodies. The charge failed. The horses recoiled, confused and wounded. The wall held. The English charged again, and again. For hours they threw themselves at the Norse formation. Each time, the shield wall buckled but did not break. When a man in the front rank fell, another from behind stepped into his place, his shield locking with his comrades'. It was a brutal, grinding fight. The wall was a meat grinder. It negated the English advantage of cavalry. It turned the battle into a close quarters test of endurance. The Norsemen, even without their armor, were holding back a full English army. They were selling their lives dearly, buying time for their reinforcements. The shield wall was not just a tactic. It was an expression of their entire way of war. It was about community, courage, and a deep, stubborn refusal to break. That day, even in a losing battle, the wall showed why these men were so feared. It could turn a sure defeat into a long, bloody struggle. Number 20, a feigned retreat was not cowardice. His name was Robert. He was a Norman knight, but his grandfather had been a Norseman from the Senne Valley. He knew the old stories, he knew the old ways. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, he sat on his warhorse on a ridge near a place the locals called Hastings. Below him, the English army stood on a hill. They were a solid line of shields, a wall just like the one his duke, William, had heard about at Stamford Bridge a few weeks prior. They were infantry, he was cavalry. The fight should have been simple, but it wasn't. For 6 hours, Robert and his fellow knights had charged that hill. And for 6 hours they had been broken. He had seen friends pulled from their saddles by long, hafted axes. He had seen horses scream and fall with spear wounds in their chests. The English shield wall was impenetrable. Morale was starting to crack. A rumor had spread that Duke William himself was dead. Robert had seen the Duke ride through the lines, his helmet off, to prove he was alive. But the fear was still there. They could not break the English line. Then the order came down the line. It was an old trick, a trick his grandfather would have recognized. They were to charge again, but this time they were to break and run. Robert's stomach turned. To turn your back on the enemy was the ultimate shame for a knight. It invited an axe in the back. It was cowardice, but it was an order from the Duke. He trusted the Duke. He gripped his reins, lowered his lance, and spurred his horse forward with the others. They thundered up the slope one more time. They crashed into the wall of shields. There was the familiar sound of steel on wood, the shouting, the chaos. Then, as one, they turned. Robert wheeled his horse and galloped back down the hill, feigning panic. He did not look back. He just ran as he was told. He could hear the roar of the English behind him. It was a sound of triumph. They thought the Normans were finally broken. That was the mistake. The English, mostly peasant levies called the feared, were not professional soldiers. They had been standing on that hill all day, holding their ground. Seeing the enemy run was too much to resist. Their discipline broke. Pockets of men surged down the hill, chasing the fleeing knights, eager for the kill. They left the safety of their shield wall, and then the trap sprung. Once the chasing Englishmen were on the flat ground, clear of their main line, another signal was given. Robert heard the horns. He pulled hard on his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal skidded in the mud. All around him, the other fleeing knights were doing the same. The feigned retreat was over. Now they were the hunters. They charged into the disorganized, scattered groups of English infantry. The fight was different now. The Englishmen were not in a solid line. They were exposed. Robert's lance found a man who had been chasing him moments before. The cavalry swept through them. It was a slaughter. They cut down the pursuers and then retreated back to their own lines, ready to do it again. And twice more that day, they used the same trick. Each time, parts of the English line broke their discipline and chased. Each time, they were cut down on the plain. The tactic slowly bled the English shield wall, weakening it, thinning its ranks. It was not cowardice. It was a cold, calculated strategy. It used the enemy's own aggression against them. By the end of the day, when the final push came, the English line was too thin to hold. Robert knew then that the old ways, the brutal cunning of his ancestors, had won the battle. Number 19, reputation was a weapon. Alcuin was a scholar, a man of God from Northumbria. He served in the court of Charlemagne in Aachen, far from his home. So it was the year 793. One day a messenger arrived, his face pale, his clothes ragged from a long journey. He brought news from the coast of Alcuin's homeland, news of a place Alcuin knew well, the holy island of Lindisfarne. The messenger's words painted a picture of horror. He spoke of dragon-headed ships appearing from the sea mist without warning. He described men with wild hair and beards, screaming in a strange tongue as they waded ashore. They had stormed the monastery, a place of peace and prayer. They were not like other warriors. They did not spare the monks. They did not respect the church. They killed those who stood in their way, stole the golden crosses and silver chalices from the altar, and dragged others away in chains. Alcuin was horrified. He wrote a letter to the Bishop of Lindisfarne. He asked, "Who has ever heard of such a terror? Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." He saw it as a punishment from God, but the men who came from the sea were not thinking of God. They were thinking of silver. The story of Lindisfarne spread like a plague. It was told in monasteries in Francia, in villages in Ireland, in towns in Wessex. The details grew with each telling. The raiders became giants. Their screams became the howls of wolves. Well, they were not just men, they were a force of nature, a scourge. This was not an accident. The Vikings understood the power of fear. Years later, in 845, a fleet of 120 ships sailed up the River Seine in Francia. They were led by a man known as Reginharus, perhaps the figure who would become the legend of Ragnar Lodbrok. As they moved towards Paris, they did not just attack, they put on a show. They stopped at a town and took 111 prisoners. Then, on an island in the Seine, in full view of the Frankish army commanded by King Charles the Bald, they performed a ritual. They hanged all 111 men. It was an act of calculated terror. It was a message: we are not here to negotiate. We do not follow your rules. We are capable of anything. The Frankish army, despite its numbers, was shaken. The people of Paris were terrified. When the Vikings reached the city, there was no great battle. King Charles did not fight. He paid them, he gave them 7,000 pounds of silver and gold to leave. This payment, the Danegeld, became a common strategy. The Vikings learned that the fear they created was often more powerful than their axes. A fleet of 50 ships could extort payment from a king who could field an army of thousands. Why? Because the king knew the cost of a fight. He knew the Vikings would burn towns, kill priests, and destroy farms. He knew the story of Lindisfarne. He had heard about the hangings on the Seine. He was not just fighting an army of men. He was fighting their reputation. That reputation, built on, shocking acts of brutality and surprise, was one of their most effective weapons. It allowed them to win victories without even having to draw their swords. Number 18, they fought smart, not just hard. Halfdan was not a great warrior. He was short, wiry, and his left shoulder ached in the cold. He could use a spear, and he was quick with a seax, the short knife every man carried. But his real value was his eyes. Was the autumn of 865, and he was part of what the English would come to call the Great Heathen Army. They had landed in East Anglia, but they did not come to raid and leave. They came to stay. Their leaders, men like Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, had a plan. Halfdan's job was to be a scout. For weeks, he and a handful of others roamed the countryside of Northumbria. They did not look like raiders. They dressed in local woolens, their weapons hidden. They learned the roads. They watched the rivers. They observed the walled towns like the great Roman city of Eboracum, which the English called York. He spent a full week just watching York. He noted the times the guards on the walls changed. He saw which gates were used most often for trade and which were left mostly unguarded. He saw that the Roman-built walls were old, crumbling in places. He talked to farmers in the market, listening to their gossip. He learned that the two kings of Northumbria, Ayala and Osbert, were rivals caught in a civil war. They were more focused on fighting each other than watching the sea. He took this information back to Ivar. He drew maps in the dirt with a stick, showing the weak points in the walls, the schedule of the patrols, the political division of their enemy. Ivar listened, his pale eyes missing nothing. He was not a man who believed in fair fights. He believed in certain victories. On the 1st of November, 866, the Vikings acted. It was All Saints' Day, a major Christian festival. The leaders and warriors of York would be in the churches praying. The city would be distracted. Using the knowledge Halfdan had gathered, the army did not launch a frontal assault. They moved quietly and quickly, targeting a section of the old wall that Halfdan had identified as weak. They swarmed over it with ladders before the alarm could be properly raised. The fighting inside the city was chaotic, but the surprise was total. The city's defenders were scattered, disorganized. By the time Ayala and Osbert realized what was happening, the Vikings controlled the gates. The York had fallen, not to a massive day-long siege, but to a swift, intelligent strike. It was a victory of information. The two Northumbrian kings, forced to unite, tried to retake the city the following March. They attacked the Vikings they had allowed to settle inside their capital. But now the Vikings had the advantage. They used the strong Roman walls that they had so easily bypassed. They knew the layout of the city. When the Northumbrians breached the walls, they were funneled into narrow streets where the Vikings were waiting for them. It became a slaughter. Both King Ayala and King Osbert were killed. Halfdan watched the aftermath from the walls. He saw the bodies of the English kings. He had not won the battle with an axe. He had won it months before with his eyes and ears. The stories would tell of the great warriors, the berserkers, the shield bearers, but the foundation of their success was often the quiet work of men like Halfdan. They replaced brute force with knowledge. They studied their enemies, found their weaknesses, and struck when and where they were least expected. They fought smart. Number 17, the longship was a weapon system. Olaf was a shipbuilder. He lived in a fjord on the western coast of Norway, where the mountains fell straight into the sea. His hands were gnarled and scarred, stained with the pine tar he used to seal the hulls. He was not a raider. He had never sailed further than the next fjord, but the ships he built had sailed to Ireland, to Francia, and beyond. He was building one now. In the year 890, it was for a local chieftain named Eric. The ship taking shape on the shore was not just a boat. To Olaf, it was a living thing, a complex machine designed for a single-purpose war. He started with the keel, a single massive piece of oak, the backbone of the vessel. From this, he and his crew built the hull. They used the clinker technique. Each long plank of oak overlapped the one below it, and they were held together with iron rivets. This made the hull incredibly strong, but also flexible. It could bend and twist in the heavy North Sea swells, moving with the water instead of fighting it. A Frankish ship was built differently. It had a deep hull, a heavy frame. It was a cargo carrier, slow and clumsy. Olaf's ship was sleek and narrow. Its most important feature was its shallow draft. Even when fully loaded with 60 men and their gear, the ship, which he called a skeed, drew only about a meter of water. This was its secret. Olaf explained this to his young son Carré as they worked. A Frankish cog cannot leave the deep water, he said, running his hand along the smooth curve of the hull. It must stay in the big rivers, in the ports. Our ship, he patted the wood, can go anywhere. It can sail up a small stream. It can land on any flat beach. We do not need a harbor. The world's coastline is our harbor. He showed Care the mast, which could be raised and lowered quickly. In the open sea, they would use the big square sail to move fast. But when they were approaching an enemy coast or moving up a river, the mast would come down. Then the men would use the oars. There were 30 oar ports on this ship. 60 men, each with an oar, could propel the ship with surprising speed and silence. They could, row against the current. They could maneuver in tight spaces. The ship was also symmetrical. The bow and the stern were nearly identical. This meant they could reverse direction instantly without having to turn the entire vessel around. It was perfect for quick strikes. They could row up a river, attack a village, and then back away into the current and be gone before a proper defense could be organized. When the ship was finished, Eric and his crew arrived. They loaded their shields along the gunwales, creating an extra wall of protection. They packed their weapons, their supplies, a few tools. The ship was not a comfortable place. It was open to the elements. Their men slept on their rowing benches, but it was fast. It was versatile. It was a platform for launching a surprise attack anywhere there was water. And Care watched as the men pushed the new ship into the fjord. He saw how it sat lightly on the water. He saw Eric's crew take to the oars, their movements practiced and synchronized. The ship moved like a water snake, fast and silent. Olaf put a hand on his son's shoulder. "That is not just wood and iron, my son," he said. "That is fear. That is surprise. It is the reason they cannot stop us. We do not fight on their terms. We bring the battle to them wherever we choose." The longship was not just a boat for carrying Vikings, it was the key to their entire way of fighting. Number 16, the shield wall was a living fortress. Our Bertnoth was the Ealdorman of Essex. He was an old man in 991 with white hair and a reputation for courage. When the message came that a Viking fleet had been sighted off the coast, he did not hesitate. He mustered his personal household troops, his housecarls, and the local militia, the Feigned. He marched them to the coast, near the town of Malden, where the River Blackwater met the sea. He found the Vikings on a small island, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that was flooded at high tide. The Viking leader, who some sources say was the future king of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, shouted across the water. He demanded tribute, gold and silver in exchange for peace. Bertnoth shouted back, his voice full of scorn. "We will pay you with spears and swords, not with gold." The tide was coming in. The causeway was impassable. Bertnoth positioned a few of his best warriors at the landward end of the causeway. As the tide began to recede, the Vikings tried to cross. The 3 English warriors held them back. They cut down every man who tried to set foot on the causeway. The Vikings, crowded and unable to bring their numbers to bear, were helpless. The Viking leader shouted again, and he called Berthnoth arrogant. He asked for a fair fight. He asked Berthnoth to let his army cross the causeway and form up on the mainland so they could have a proper battle. It was a challenge to his honor. Berthnoth, in a decision that would be debated for centuries, agreed. He pulled his men back from the causeway. He said it was because of his overmode, his overconfidence, or pride. He would not win through tricks of terrain. He would face them in open battle. As the Vikings poured across the causeway, Berthnoth arranged his men. He dismounted from his horse, sending it away. He would fight on foot with his soldiers. He ordered them to form the Sildbur, the shield wall. He walked along the line, adjusting men's positions, telling them how to hold their shields, how to brace for the shock. The men locked their shields together, a wall of linden wood and iron bosses. Spears bristled from the gaps. The battle began. The Vikings hurled a volley of throwing spears. Then they charged. The crash against the English shield wall was immense. The wall groaned and bent, but it held. The fight became a brutal, pushing, stabbing match. Men in the front rank jabbed with their short swords and sea axes under or over the shields. Men in the ranks behind used their long spears to stab at the enemy over the heads of their comrades. Berthnoth fought in the front rank, an old man leading by example. He killed several Vikings, but then he was wounded. A thrown spear struck him. He faltered. A Viking warrior rushed forward to finish him and strip his armor. Berthnoth, though wounded, struck the man with his sword, but his arm was too weak. He dropped his weapon. He was cut down. The death of a commander should have broken the English line. For many of the feared, it did. They saw their leader fall, and they fled. But Berthnoth's housecarls, his loyal retainers, did not run. They tightened the shield wall around their fallen lord's body. An old warrior named Bertwald raised his spear and shouted, "Mine shall be the harder, heart the keener, courage the greater, as our strength lessens." They knew they were going to die, but they would die there, protecting their lord's body, fighting to the last man. The shield wall was more than a formation. It was a pact. It was a promise to the man standing next to you. It turned a group of individuals into a single, stubborn beast that was incredibly hard to kill. Even in defeat, the men at Malden showed its true strength. It was not just about defense, it was about brotherhood and a grim refusal to yield even when all hope was lost. Number 15. Their gods demanded a good death. Ulf, the quiet, was not quiet because he was shy. He was quiet because he rarely saw the need for word. He was a follower of a jarl named Sigurd, and in the year 1014 he found himself on a muddy field in Ireland near a place called Clontarf. He was part of a huge Viking army, allied with Irishmen from Leinster, ready to fight the army of the Irish High King, Brian Boru. The night before the battle, Ulf did not pray for victory. He did not ask Odin for protection. He sat by the fire, sharpening the edge of his broad axe. He thought about the stories the skalds told, stories of Valhalla, the great hall where warriors who died in battle went. There, they would feast every night and fight every day, preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. To die of old age, sick in a bed, was a straw death, a thing of shame. To die in battle was the goal. It was the only way to earn a seat at Odin's table. This belief was not just a story, it was the core of Ulf's world. It removed the fear of death. Or rather, it replaced the fear of death with the fear of a bad death. The battle began at sunrise on Good Friday. It was a huge, sprawling, and incredibly savage affair. Tens of thousands of men clashed on the fields outside Dublin. Ulf was in the shield wall, his shoulder pressed against the man next to him. He was not a berserker, a wild-eyed fanatic. He was a professional. He fought with a cold, focused efficiency. He saw a gap open in the enemy line. An Irish warrior wearing a fine helmet was directing his men. He was a leader. Ulf and 2 others from his shield group broke from their own lines. They did not shout or scream, they just moved forward, a small, determined unit. They ignored the lesser warriors who tried to stop them, batting them aside with their shields. Their target was the man in the helmet. A spearman lunged at Ulf. Ulf caught the shaft on his shield, twisted, and brought his axe down on the man's arm. He did not pause to see the result. He kept moving forward. The Irish leader saw them coming. He raised his own sword, but it was 3 against 1. Ulf's companion slammed his shield into the man, knocking him off balance. Ulf's axe did the rest. The leader's fall caused confusion in the Irish line. The Vikings pressed their advantage, surging forward. For a moment, it looked like they might break through, but Brian Boru's army was disciplined. They closed the gap. The battle raged on. Later in the day, Ulf was cut off from his companions. He was surrounded by 3 Irishmen. He felt a spear thrust into his leg, and he stumbled. Another jabbed at his side, finding a gap below his mail shirt. Pain flared in his gut. He knew he was dying. He fell to one knee, his shield heavy. He could have tried to surrender. But the thought never entered his mind. He looked at the men surrounding him. He let out a great roar, not of pain, but of defiance. He pushed himself up and lunged forward, swinging his axe in a wide arc. He took one of his attackers down with him before the others finished him. His last thought was of the Valkyries, the chooser of the slain, who he believed would now carry him from the battlefield. He had not won the battle for his Jarl. The Vikings and their allies lost at Clontarf that day, but Ulf had won his own victory. He had died on his feet, with a weapon in his hand, facing his enemies. In his world, there was no higher achievement. This mindset, this active seeking of a glorious death in combat, made Viking warriors incredibly dangerous. They did not fight to survive. They fought to die well. Number 14, the axe was a tool of pure terror. It was the year 860. A young man named Finn stood on the walls of a fortified monastery on the coast of Ireland. He was a novice, not a warrior. He was terrified. Below, longships were beached on the sand. A horde of Norsemen was advancing on their gate. And at their front were the axemen. Finn had seen swords, he had seen spears, but the axes were different. These were not the small axes used for chopping wood. They were massive, two-handed weapons. The heads were wide and flared, bearded, so they could be used to hook shields or limbs. The handles were long, some as tall as a man. They were the Dane axes. The Vikings reached the heavy oak gate of the monastery. A few men with swords and spears tried to attack the hinges, with little effect. Then a huge man stepped forward. He wore no helmet, and his red beard was braided. He carried one of the great axes. He planted his feet wide. He swung the axe. The sound of the impact echoed across the courtyard. It was not a sharp crack, but a deep, resonant thump that Finn felt in his chest. A huge splinter of wood flew from the gate. The man swung again, and again. Each blow landed with sickening force. He was not just chopping at the gate, he was shattering it. The sheer power was horrifying. A sword was for cutting. A spear was for stabbing. This axe was for demolition. The gate began to break apart. The monks and local defenders behind it tried to brace it, but it was useless. A final swing tore a huge hole in the planks. The Vikings poured through. Finn watched, frozen, as the axeman entered the courtyard. An Irish warrior, a guard for the monastery, charged him with a sword and shield. The axeman did not try to block with his weapon. He couldn't. It required both hands. Instead, he used a surprising agility. He sidestepped the warrior's thrust and swung the axe in a low, horizontal arc. The Irish warrior raised his shield to block. The axe hit the shield. It did not just dent it. It split the wooden shield in two, sheared through the iron boss in the center, and continued on. It struck the warrior in the hip, cutting deep through his mail and bone. The man screamed and collapsed. Finn saw that the axe was not just a weapon of brute force, it had a psychological effect. No one wanted to be near it. Shields were useless against it. A well-aimed swing could kill a horse, or shear a man's arm off, even through armor. It created a wide circle of death around its wielder. Men who used the two-handed axe could not carry a shield, so they relied on the men in the shield wall to protect their flanks, while they acted as shock troops, breaking enemy formations. The Vikings who used these weapons were often the biggest and strongest men, the shock troops of the army. In a shield wall battle, they would stand in the front ranks. Their job was to shatter the enemy's shield wall. They would use the long reach of the axe to hook the top of an enemy's shield and pull it down, exposing the man behind it for a spear thrust from a comrade. Or they would simply smash through the shield with brute force. Finn eventually broke from his terror and ran. He hid in a cellar as the sounds of the sack echoed above. The sound he remembered most was not the screaming. It was the rhythmic, terrible thump, thump, thump of the axes breaking down door after door. It was the sound of unstoppable destruction. The axe wasn't just a piece of steel, it was a tool that amplified a man's strength into something monstrous, and it was a symbol of the Vikings' brutal effectiveness. Number 13, the Svinfylking was a spearhead of men. Olaf Haraldsson, who would one day be the patron saint of Norway, stood on a hill at Stiklestad in 1030. He was trying to reclaim his kingdom. His army was small, a mix of loyal followers and Swedish mercenaries. Below him was a much larger army of Norwegian chieftains who opposed him. He knew a standard shield wall battle would be a disaster. He would be outflanked and crushed by sheer numbers. He needed an edge. He decided to use an old formation, the Svinfylking, the Boar's Snout. A young warrior named Ketil was in Olaf's army. He had never fought in this formation before. The orders were passed down the line. They were not to form a long defensive wall. They were to form a wedge, like the head of a spear. The point of the wedge was made up of the two best warriors. Behind them were 4, behind them 6, and so on, the ranks growing wider. Ketil found his place somewhere in the middle of one of the flanks. The formation felt strange. It was tight, claustrophobic. Men were packed in close, their shields not just beside them, but also in front and behind. It was not a line for holding ground. It was a formation designed for one thing to punch a hole in the enemy. King Olaf himself, a big, powerful man, was said to be in the front ranks of the wedge, not commanding from the rear. This was a leader's formation. It required immense courage from those at the point who would bear the full brunt of the enemy line. Ketil could see the enemy army below. They were formed in a long traditional shield wall. They looked solid, unbreakable, and Olaf's plan seemed like suicide, throwing their small force directly at the strongest part of the enemy. The horns blew. The wedge began to move forward, slowly at first, then picking up speed. It was not a wild charge. It was a disciplined, heavy march. The sound was just the tramp of 1,000 feet and the clatter of weapons. As they got closer, Ketil could see the faces of the men in the enemy shield wall. They looked confused. They were used to armies trying to outflank them, not charge directly at their center, then they hit. The point of the wedge crashed into the shield wall with incredible force. All the weight and momentum of Olaf's army was concentrated on a few men. The enemy line buckled. Ketil felt the immense pressure as the men in front of him pushed forward, and the men behind him pushed him. The wedge was a human battering ram. The front of the enemy shield wall broke. The wedge pushed through the gap, shattering their formation. Inside the enemy lines, it was chaos. The wedge continued to drive forward, widening the breach, while the men on its flanks, like Ketil, fought the enemies who were now on their sides. The fight was no longer a structured battle of shield walls. It was a swirling melee. For the men in the peasant army facing Olaf, the experience was terrifying. Their solid line had been instantly broken. They were being attacked from the front and from within their own ranks. Their cohesion was gone. Panic began to spread. Olaf's plan almost worked. The Svinfylking successfully broke the enemy line. But he did not have enough men to exploit the breakthrough. The larger enemy army was able to surround the wedge and attack it from all sides. The battle turned into a desperate struggle. King Olaf was killed and his army was defeated. Ketill was one of the lucky few who managed to escape. But he never forgot the feeling of being in the wedge. He understood its power. It was a high-risk, high-reward tactic. It required incredible discipline and courage, but it was the perfect tool for a smaller, more aggressive army to use against a larger, more static foe. It was designed not to defend, but to utterly shatter the enemy's core in a single, decisive blow. Number 12, they targeted the head. Geirmund the helmsman stood at the tiller of his ship as it cut through the waters of the Irish Sea in 902. They had been driven out of Dublin, a city they had controlled for decades. Now they were scattered, looking for new opportunities, new places to plunder. They were a fleet without a home, and their leader, a jarl named Ingemund, was ambitious. They decided to attack Chester, a well-defended Anglo-Saxon town with strong Roman walls. The first assaults failed. The walls were too high, the defenders too numerous. The Vikings took heavy casualties. Their morale was low. Ingemund gathered his chieftains, including Geirmund. They could not give up. A defeat here, after being chased from Dublin, would destroy their reputation and their army. Ingemund's plan was not to attack the walls again. It was to attack the leader. The Anglo-Saxons were led by the Lady of the Mercians, Eathelflaed. She was a formidable ruler, a true warrior queen, but she was not on the walls herself. Her army was commanded by her ealdorman. He was always visible, moving along the ramparts, shouting orders, his fine helmet and banner making him easy to spot. The plan was simple and brutal. They would focus all their missile fire on one person. Every man with a bow, every man with a throwing spear was to aim for the ealdorman. It was not about killing soldiers, it was about cutting the head off the snake. The next day, the Vikings approached the walls again. But instead of bringing ladders, they brought their archers to the front. Geirmund was given a bow. He was a better sailor than an archer, but he could shoot. He found a spot with a clear view of the walls. He saw the ealdorman, just as Ingemund had described, walking along the battlements. The signal was given. 100 bows drew at once. 100 arrows arced through the air. They were not aimed at the mass of soldiers on the wall, and they were all aimed at that one small spot. The first volley was a storm of arrows. The ealdorman's bodyguards raised their shields, but it was impossible to block them all. Geirmund saw the man stagger. He wasn't sure if he was hit. Another volley went up, and another. The Vikings were relentless. They ignored the arrows and stones coming from the walls. Their only focus was the commander. The Anglo-Saxon defense began to falter. The soldiers on the walls were distracted, looking at their leader, who was now surrounded by a thick cloud of arrows. Then Geirmund saw him fall. A great cry went up from the Vikings. A sound of despair rose from the walls. The defense, which had been so coordinated and fierce, became confused. Orders were no longer being shouted. Some soldiers began to fall back. The chain of command was broken. Ingemund chose that exact moment to signal the main assault. The warriors with the ladders, who had been waiting, surged forward. They met a disorganized and demoralized defense. The loss of the commander had shattered the will of his men. The Vikings took the walls. This tactic was used time and time again. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the death of Harold Hardrada, struck in the throat by an arrow, was the turning point. At Hastings, the English line held firm for hours until their king, Harold Godwinson, was killed. Once the leader was gone, the army, which was often a collection of loyal retainers bound by an oath to one man, often lost its reason to fight. The Vikings knew this. They did not just fight armies, they hunted kings. Number 11 amphibious assault was their default. It was dawn in the year 841. A fisherman named Ronan was mending his nets on the bank of the River Liffey in Ireland. He had heard stories of the Northmen, but they had never come this far up the river. He looked out at the water and saw something that made his blood run cold. 10, 20, maybe 30 longships were gliding up the river, their oars rising and falling in perfect, silent unison. They were not sailing, they were being rowed, moving with a predator's quiet purpose. They did not make for the small trading settlement nearby. Instead, they steered their ships directly at the riverbank, a few hundred yards from where Ronan was hiding in the reeds. The keels of the ships scraped on the gravelly shore. Before they had even come to a complete stop, men were leaping over the sides into the shallow water. There was no hesitation, there was no complex process of disembarkation. One moment they were a fleet on the water, the next they were an army on land. Ronan watched in awe and terror. The men moved with practiced speed. The first men ashore formed a small, protective shield wall, their spears facing out, securing the beachhead. Behind this screen, the rest of the crew swarmed off the ships. They were not just warriors, they were a self-contained invasion force. Some men began unloading supplies, others were pulling the ships further up the beach. A leader was pointing, directing men to form a larger defensive line. Within minutes, what had been a peaceful riverbank was a fortified Viking camp. They began to build a temporary defensive wall, a long fort, using wood from their ships and earth from the bank. This camp would become the foundation of the city of Dublin. This was their great strategic advantage. They were masters of the transition from sea to land. For a Frankish or Anglo-Saxon army, moving by sea was a major logistical undertaking. They needed deep harbors, docks, and a long time to load and unload men and equipment. For the Vikings, any beach or riverbank was a potential landing zone. Their entire military structure was built around this concept. The basic unit of their army was the crew of a single ship, the skipan. These 40 to 60 men lived, sailed, and fought together. They were a cohesive unit, a band of brothers. When they landed, they did not need to be organized into new companies or battalions. They fought as they sailed as a single crew. A fleet of 20 ships was an army of 20 coordinated companies. This amphibious capability meant they could appear anywhere, at any time. They could sail hundreds of miles up the Rhine, the Seine, or the Thames, striking deep into the heart of a kingdom, far from the coastal forts designed to stop them. You know, they could land on an undefended stretch of coast, march inland, burn a town, and, be back on their ships and sailing away before the local lord could even muster his army. Ronan watched as the Vikings finished their work. They were now an army on his land, secure in their new base. They had not asked for permission. They had not needed a friendly port. They had simply turned a piece of shoreline into their own territory. Their ships were not just transportation. They were mobile invasion platforms, allowing them to project their power wherever water could carry them. This seamless movement between water and earth was the engine of the Viking Age. Number 10, logistics were simple. They took yours. In the winter of 873, a warrior named Catiel was camped with the great heathen army by the River Trent at a place called Repton. It was cold. The wind howled across the flat Mercian landscape, but inside their fortified camp, Catiel was warm. He was eating bread baked from English wheat and salted pork from an English farm. He was drinking ale brewed from English barley. He was not a quartermaster. He had never seen a Viking supply train. Their army did not have one. Back in Denmark, he was a farmer. He knew how much work it took to grow a field of wheat, to raise a pig. It was a year's labor. Here in England, he just took it. The Viking way of war was not sustained by a complex logistical tale stretching back to Scandinavia. It was sustained by the lands they invaded. Their strategy was simple: live off the land. When they arrived in a new territory like East Anglia or Mercia, their first act was often not to fight a battle, but to secure frith, or peace, with the local king. This was not a real peace. It was extortion. The English king would pay them a tribute of gold and silver, and crucially, he would provide them with supplies and horses. The great heathen army, which numbered in the thousands, needed a huge amount of food to survive. They also needed horses to give them mobility. They did not bring thousands of horses with them on their ships. They took them from the local population. In 865, the East Anglian king gave them horses, turning their sea-based force into a mobile army that could strike anywhere on the island. This had two effects. First, it allowed the Viking army to operate independently, deep in enemy territory for years on end. They were not tied to a supply line that could be cut. They were a self-sustaining organism, a parasite that consumed its host. As long as there were farms to raid and monasteries to plunder, they could keep fighting. Second, it was a weapon of economic warfare. Every sack of grain they took was a sack of grain an English army could not use. Every horse they stole was a horse an English soldier could not ride. And they were not just feeding themselves, they were starving their enemy. They systematically stripped a region of its wealth and resources, weakening its ability to resist. Catiel remembered a raid on a monastery a few months earlier. They had taken the gold, of course, but they had also emptied the granaries, rounded up all the cattle and sheep, and taken every tool from the workshops. They left the monks with nothing. The monastery, a center of the local economy, was ruined. It could no longer support the community or pay taxes to the king. This was the brutal reality of Viking logistics. Their armies traveled light because they intended to find everything they needed at their destination. This made them fast and unpredictable. They were not just an army, they were an economic disaster. They did not just defeat kingdoms with swords and axes. They broke them by eating their food, stealing their horses, and draining their wealth until there was nothing left to fight with. For Catiel, sitting by the fire in Repton, it was just common sense. Why carry what your enemy will provide for you? Number 9, winter was not an obstacle, but an opportunity. Guthrum was a king in the great heathen army. He had seen years of success. They had conquered Northumbria, taken East Anglia, and broken the kingdom of Mercia. By the winter of 877, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained, Wessex, ruled by a young king named Alfred. In previous wars, winter had been a time of rest. Armies would disband and go into winter quarters. Fighting was for the spring and summer, but Guthrum and his fellow leaders did not think that way. For them, winter was a weapon. They knew their enemies would be scattered, celebrating Christmas and the New Year at their homes. They would be unprepared. In early January 878, just after the Feast of Twelfth Night, Guthrum launched his attack. It was a surprise winter campaign. He led his army from their base in Gloucester and struck deep into Wessex. The attack was a complete shock. Alfred was at his royal estate at Chippenham in Wiltshire. He was celebrating Christmas, holding court, not preparing for war. For a warrior in Guthrum's army, a Dane named Hastings was part of the force that stormed Chippenham. They rode hard through the cold, their horses' breath steaming in the air. The Saxons had no scouts out. They expected no attack. Hastings' group was among the first to reach the town. They met almost no resistance. They swept through the royal estate, but King Alfred was gone. He had been warned at the last minute and had escaped with a few followers. The capture of the royal town was a huge victory, but the escape of the king was a problem. Alfred fled into the marshes of Somerset, a wild and difficult terrain of swamps and islands. For any other army, he would have been safe. But the Vikings were used to difficult terrain. They established a fortified base at Chippenham, turning Alfred's own town into their winter headquarters. From here, they dominated the surrounding area. This strategy of wintering over was a key Viking innovation. The early raids had been summer affairs, but the Great Heathen Army was different. They would seize a strategic location, often a monastery or a Roman walled town like York or London, and fortify it. They would then spend the winter there, safe from attack. This allowed them to rest, repair their equipment, and plan the next year's campaign. It also allowed them to terrorize the local countryside all year round. There was no longer a safe season for the English. From his new base at Chippenham, Guthrum sent out raiding parties. They plundered the farms and villages of Wessex, gathering supplies and spreading fear. Hastings was on several of these raids. The land was his. There was no army to stop him. For a few months, it seemed as if the last English kingdom had fallen. The Vikings controlled almost all of England. Alfred's escape, however, proved crucial. He spent the winter hiding in the marshes, a guerrilla leader. In the spring, he sent out messengers and gathered the militias of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. At a place called Ethandune, he met Guthrum's army in battle and won a decisive victory. But the winter campaign had almost worked. It showed the Viking strategic mindset. They did not play by the established rules of European warfare. They saw the calendar not as a set of limitations, but as a set of opportunities. Using winter as a time for war allowed them to achieve a level of surprise that was almost impossible for their more conventional enemies to counter. It was a brutal, relentless approach to war that gave no quarter and no rest. Number 8, small unit cohesion was everything. Bjarni was the steersman of a longship. His crew, 42 men in all, were from the same village in a fjord near Kaupang. He had known most of them since they were boys. He had sailed with them, fished with them, and drank with them. He knew who was steady in a storm, and who was quick to anger. This was his skipan, his ship's crew, and on the battlefield, it was his regiment. In the year 994, Bjarni's ship was part of a large fleet sailing up the Thames, led by Olaf Tryggvason and Sweyn Forkbeard. Their target was London. The city was defended by a stone wall and a determined populace. The Vikings launched a major assault. Bjarni's crew was assigned a section of the wall to attack. As they advanced with their ladders, they did not move as a disorganized mob. They moved as a unit. At the front were the men with the heaviest shields and armor, including a large man named Thorstein, who carried a massive Dane axe. Their job was to create a breach. Behind them were men with spears, ready to exploit any opening. Bjarni and a few others were tasked with providing covering fire with bows. They were a self-sufficient fighting team. Thorstein, protected by the shields of the men next to him, began to work on a wooden gate near their section of the wall. His axe crashed against the timber. The Londoners on the wall above rained down stones and arrows. One of Bjarni's crewmates, a young man named Leif, was struck by a crossbow bolt and went down. Instantly, 2 others dragged him back out of the line of fire. They did not abandon him. There was no every man for himself. Bjarni loosed arrow after arrow at the men on the wall, trying to force them to keep their heads down to give Thorstein time to work. He saw Olaf, his shield brother, take a spear in the arm. Without a word, another man stepped into Olaf's place in the shield line, keeping the formation solid. This was the strength of the Viking army. It was not a single entity commanded from the top down. It was a collection of highly cohesive, semi-independent units, the ship's crews. Each crew was a war band. They trained together, they knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, and they were bound by loyalty to each other and their captain. The attack on London failed. The city's defenses were too strong, but the Vikings did not break and flee in chaos. They conducted an organized retreat, crew by crew, each unit covering the withdrawal of the next. Bjarni's crew pulled back, carrying their wounded, their shields facing the enemy, until they were back at the ships. Later, the army moved into the countryside. Bjarni's crew was sent on a raid to gather supplies. They acted alone, a single ship operating deep in enemy territory. They rowed up a small tributary of the Thames, landed, and marched several miles inland to a wealthy estate. They overwhelmed the small guard, loaded their plunder onto carts they took from the farm, and were back at their ship before any real defense could be mustered. This cellular structure made the Viking army incredibly flexible. It could gather into a large force for a major battle, as at London, or it could disperse into dozens of small raiding parties, plundering a huge area of countryside simultaneously. It was an army that could concentrate its force or spread it out, making it almost impossible to defend against. The foundation of this power was not the king or the jarl, it was the deep personal bond between the men of a single ship like Bjarni and his crew. Number 7, they wore more armor than you think. Sten was a blacksmith in Birka, a thriving trading town in Sweden around the year 950. He did not just make nails and farm tools. He was a master of a much more valuable craft-making mail armor. He would sit for hours in his smoky workshop drawing thin iron wire and coiling it around a rod. Then he would cut the coils into individual rings. The real work came next. Using a small pair of pliers, he would link the rings together in a 4-in-1 pattern, where each ring was linked to 4 others. And this was not simple mail, where the rings were just butted together. For every solid, punched-out ring, he would link a riveted ring. He would flatten the ends of an open ring, overlap them, punch a tiny hole through them, and then hammer a tiny rivet to close it. It was painstaking, mind-numbing work. A single shirt of mail, a burnie, could contain over 30,000 rings and take hundreds of hours to make. As a result, mail was incredibly expensive. It cost more than a small farm. Only kings, jarls, and their professional household warriors, the housecarls or herd, could afford it. The popular image of a Viking warrior as a wild man in leather and fur was mostly wrong, at least for the elite. The leaders and professional soldiers were well equipped. One of Sten's customers was a chieftain named Rolf. Rolf brought Sten a pouch of silver coins, payment for a new burnie. He was a veteran of many raids. He told Sten, "Leather can be cut. A thick tunic can be pierced, but mail, good mail like yours, turns aside a sword cut. A spear might break a ring or two, but it will not punch through." He also commissioned a new helmet. Sten forged it from 4 pieces of iron, riveted together to form a conical shape. He added a spectacle guard that protected the eyes and nose, a design common in that era. The helmet was simple, strong, and effective. It had no horns. Sten had never seen a warrior wear a helmet with horns. That was a fantasy. A horn on a helmet was just something for an enemy's axe to catch on. The average Viking warrior, the bondy or free farmer who was called to serve, could not afford this equipment. He would fight with his wooden shield, a spear, and perhaps a leather cap or a simple iron helmet, if he was lucky. But in any significant Viking army, the core would be a contingent of professional warriors who were heavily armored. The effectiveness of this armor was clear in battle. A well-armored housecarl in the front rank of a shield wall was a formidable opponent. He could withstand blows that would kill a lesser-equipped soldier. His mail would stop slashing sword cuts and deflect glancing spear thrusts. His helmet would turn away blows to the head. This allowed him to fight more aggressively, confident in his protection. This created a 2-tiered army. The wealthy, well-armored professionals formed the core, the cutting edge of the force. The less-equipped farmers provided the numbers and support. The sagas are full of descriptions of valuable mail shirts and helmets, passed down from father to son or taken from a defeated enemy as precious loot. Sten finished Rolf's mail shirt. It was heavy, weighing over 12 kilograms. It was a significant weight to carry and fight in. But as he handed it to the chieftain, he knew he was handing him life. In the brutal close-quarters combat of a shield wall, this interlocking web of tiny iron rings was the difference between a shallow cut and a fatal wound. The Vikings were not just savages, their elite were well-protected professionals. Number 6, the Sikhs was a weapon of last resort. The shield wall had broken. It was the Battle of Ashdown in 871. A young Saxon farmer named Edric, part of the West Saxon Fyrd, found himself face-to-face with a Dane. His spear was broken, his shield was splintered, the Dane lunged, and Edric stumbled backwards, falling over the body of a dead comrade. The Dane stood over him, raising his axe for the final blow. Edric had one weapon left. Tucked into his belt was his seeks. It was a long, single-edged knife, almost a short sword. The blade was heavy, with a thick spine designed for chopping and thrusting. Every man, Saxon and Viking alike, carried one. It was a tool. He used it for cutting rope, for skinning animals, for carving wood. But it was also a weapon. As the Dane brought his axe down, Edric rolled desperately to one side. The axe head buried itself in the muddy ground next to him. In that split second, Edric drew his seeks. He didn't have time to get to his feet. He scrambled forward, low to the ground, inside the Dane's reach. The Dane was struggling to pull his axe free from the mud. Edric drove the point of his seeks upwards into the Dane's unarmored groin. He put all his weight behind the thrust. The Dane screamed, a high, thin sound, and collapsed. Edric scrambled away, gasping for breath. his hand still holding the bloody knife. The Sikhs was the weapon of the brawl, the desperate fight when formations had shattered and longer weapons were useless. In the tight press of a shield wall, a man might not have room to swing a sword or an axe, but he could always draw his Sikhs and make a quick, brutal stab under a shield or into a gap in armor. A Viking warrior named Gunnar, fighting in the same battle, found himself in a similar situation. He was locked shield to shield with a big Saxon housecarl. He couldn't use his spear, he couldn't swing his axe. They were just pushing, grunting, trying to gain an inch of ground. Gunnar let go of his axe, letting it hang from a wrist strap. He drew his own Sikhs. He watched the Saxons' feet. He saw an opening. He dropped to one knee, pushing his shield up to protect his head. With his other hand, he stabbed his Sikhs into the Saxon's calf. The Saxon roared in pain, and his leg buckled. His shield dipped for a moment. It was the only opening Gunnar needed. The Viking behind Gunnar, seeing the opening, drove his long spear through the gap and into the Saxon's chest. The Sikhs was not a primary weapon, it was a backup, but it was a deadly one. It was a symbol of the Viking approach to combat: be prepared for anything. When the elegant tactics of the shield wall and the long reach of the spear failed, the fight would devolve into a chaotic, close quarters struggle. In that world, the simple, brutal utility of the long knife was often what decided who lived and who died. It was the weapon for the moment when the plans were gone, and all that was left was the will to survive. Edric, the Saxon farmer, got to his feet, clutching his Sikhs. He had survived. That was all that mattered. Number 5, their berserkers were a psychological shock tactic. Tryggve was a young warrior in the army of Harold Fairhair at the Great Naval Battle of Hafrsfjord around 872. It was the battle that would unify Norway. Tryggve was on one of the ships, oar in hand, as they approached the enemy fleet. The battle began, as they often did, with ships lashing together to create floating platforms for infantry to fight on. Tryggve was nervous. This was his first great battle. Then he heard it, a low sound coming from the prow of his own ship. It started as a growl and grew into a full-throated roar. It was not a human sound, it was the sound of a beast. 12 men stood at the front of the ship. They were the berserkir, the bare shirts. They wore no armor, some not even a shirt, their chests bare to the enemy. They were biting the rims of their shields, their eyes wide and unfocused. They seemed to be in a trance. The sagas describe them as being possessed by a battle fury, the berserker gang. They were said to be immune to pain, to have the strength of 10 men. They howled like wolves and growled like bears. As the ships crashed together, these 12 men were the first to leap across to the enemy deck. Tryggve watched in horrified fascination. They did not fight like other men. They did not form a shield line. They were pure chaotic aggression. A berserker named Kveldulf, a man as big as an ox, charged into the enemy ranks alone. He swung a huge axe, but he also kicked, bit, and clawed. The enemy warriors, disciplined soldiers, seemed terrified. They fell back before his onslaught. They stabbed him with spears, but he did not seem to notice the wounds. He just kept killing until he was finally overwhelmed by sheer numbers and fell. The purpose of the berserkers was not just to kill the enemy. It was to terrify them. They were a psychological weapon. They were deployed at the start of a battle to create a shockwave of fear and confusion, to break the enemy's morale and cohesion before the main fight even began. Seeing a man who appeared to be immune to pain and possessed by a mad fury could make even a veteran warrior question his chances. Modern scholars have debated what caused the berserker gang. Some suggest it was a self-induced hysteria or a ritualistic trance. Others have proposed the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms, though there is little direct evidence for this. Another theory is that it was a form of post-traumatic stress, a learned combat behavior. Whatever the cause for Tryggve, it was real. The berserkers on his side gave him courage. They were a terrifying force of nature unleashed on their foes. After their initial suicidal charge had disrupted the enemy's front line, the main body of warriors, including Tryggve, swarmed onto the enemy ship. The fight was still hard, but the berserkers had given them the crucial first advantage. They had sown chaos. Tryggvi fought his way across the deck, his spear and shield working in concert with the men around him. He saw another berserker, wounded and bleeding from a dozen places, still on his feet, still fighting with a broken sword. He fought until he literally could not stand anymore. The berserker phenomenon was rare, likely reserved for specific cults or warrior lodges. They were not a standard part of every Viking army, but the stories about them spread far and wide. The fear of the berserker was a powerful tool. Even if an enemy army did not have berserkers, their opponents might fear that they did. They were the ultimate expression of the Viking warrior ethos, a complete and terrifying abandonment to the chaos of battle. Number 4, training began in childhood and never stopped. Asgeir was 10 years old. He lived in a small farming community in Jutland in the late 8th century. His life was not easy. From the time he could walk, he had chores. He herded sheep, he helped his father mend fences, he carried water from the well. His body was hard and strong from a young age, but his education was not just about farming. His father, a man who had been on several raids in his youth, also taught him how to fight. It was not formal training, it was part of life. He learned to use an axe, first by chopping wood, learning its weight and balance. He learned to use a spear, first by hunting small game, learning how to throw it accurately and with force. Play was a form of training. Asgeir and the other boys in the village played games that built the skills of a warrior. They had wrestling matches which built strength and grappling skills. They had running and swimming races which built endurance. They threw stones at targets which trained their aim. They had mock battles using wooden swords and shields. These were not gentle games. Bruises and bloody noses were common. They learned to take a blow and to give one back. A man's honor and reputation, his dray was everything. Insults could lead to violence. From a young age, Asgeir learned that he had to be ready to defend himself, not just in a battle, but in a dispute with a neighbor. This constant state of readiness, this expectation of violence, shaped the entire society. When a dispute between two men could not be settled, it might be resolved with a holmgang, a formal duel. It was fought on a small island or a marked-off piece of land. There were strict rules, but it was a fight to the death or to first blood. The existence of the holmgang meant that every free man had to have a basic competence in combat. You could not rely on a distant king's justice to solve all your problems. You had to be able to solve them yourself, with steel. By the time Asgeir was 16, he was a man. He was given his own weapons, a solid iron-tipped spear and a round shield made of linden wood. He had saved for years to buy a decent steel axe head. He knew how to use them. He had been practicing for a decade. He joined a local chieftain for his first raid. On the ship, the older warriors continued the training. They practiced formations on sandy beaches. They had sparring matches on deck. The training never stopped. A warrior was always honing his skills, keeping his body strong, his reflexes sharp. In his first real fight on the coast of Francia, Asgeir was not a terrified boy. He was a prepared young man. When the shield wall was formed, he knew where to stand. He knew how to overlap his shield with the man next to him. He knew how to use his spear from the second rank, stabbing over his comrade's shoulder. The chaos of battle was still frightening, but his actions were second nature. They had been drilled into him since he was a child. This was the hidden strength of the Vikings. They did not have formal military academies. Their entire society was a training ground. Every boy grew up knowing that he would likely have to fight, and he learned the skills to do so as a natural part of growing up. This created a population where a large percentage of the men were not just farmers, they were part-time soldiers, ready to be called upon, with a lifetime of informal training behind them. Number 3, they were masters of adaptability. In the year 911, a Viking leader named Rollo and his followers were granted land in northern Francia. They had been raiding the area for years, and the Frankish king Charles the Simple decided it was better to give them land in exchange for peace and protection than to keep fighting them. This land became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. A young warrior named Ansgar was with Rollo. He had grown up on a longship raiding the coasts. He knew how to fight on foot in a shield wall. But now his life was changing. He was no longer a raider. He was a landowner in a foreign country surrounded by Franks. The Franks fought differently. Their elite warriors were knights, heavily armored men who fought on horseback. Ansgar saw their power. A cavalry charge could shatter an unprepared infantry line. He and his fellow Norsemen realized that to survive and hold their new land, they could not just keep fighting in the old way. They had to adapt. Ansgar learned to ride a horse, not just for travel, but for combat. It was a difficult transition. The balance, the control, the need to fight with one hand while controlling a powerful animal with the other, it was all new. He learned to use a lance, a weapon designed for the charge. He and his comrades began to adopt Frankish armor, including the kite-shaped shields that were better for protecting the leg while on horseback. Within a generation, the Vikings of Normandy had transformed. They were no longer sea raiders who fought on foot. They had become some of the most formidable cavalry in Europe. They blended their own fierce, aggressive spirit with Frankish military technology and tactics. This new hybrid warrior, the Norman knight, would go on to conquer England, southern Italy, and parts of the Middle East. This was not the only example of their adaptability. Far to the east, other Vikings, known as the Russes, traveled the great rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They fought the nomadic tribes of the steppe, like the Pechenegs, who were masters of horse archery. A shield wall was useless against an enemy who could ride circles around you and shower you with arrows. So the Russes adapted. They learned to fight alongside their Slavic allies, using the terrain, building fortified camps, and sometimes even incorporating cavalry into their forces. Even further south, some Norsemen traveled to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. There, they served as elite mercenaries in the emperor's personal bodyguard, the Varangian Guard. And a man named Boli Boleson from Iceland served in the guard in the 11th century. In Iceland, he would have fought with an axe and shield. In Constantinople, he was outfitted by the emperor. He wore Byzantine lamellar armor, carried a Greek sword, and was trained to fight in disciplined Byzantine formations. He fought in Anatolia against the Seljuk Turks and in Italy against the Normans, his own distant cousins. He had to learn entirely new ways of war to survive and prosper. The key to the Vikings' long-term success was not a single, unchanging set of tactics. It was their ability to learn, to adapt, and to absorb the military traditions of the people they fought and lived among. They were pragmatists. They used what worked, whether it was becoming a Norman knight, a Rus's river warrior, or a Varangian guardsman. They proved they were not bound by tradition. They were survivors and innovators, able to change their methods to meet any threat. Number 2, they understood the value of a good fort. In the autumn of 879, a Viking army that had been campaigning in Francia sailed up the Thames and then marched to Fulham, on the outskirts of London. They did not attack the city. Instead, they built a camp. Their leader, a man whose name is lost to history, chose the site carefully. It was on the river, allowing their ships to supply them and providing an escape route. It was also on a major road, allowing them to control movement in the area. A warrior named Einar was part of the construction crew. They did not build with stone. They built with what was available, earth and timber. They dug a wide, deep ditch around the perimeter of their chosen site. The earth from the ditch was thrown inwards to create a high bank, or rampart. On top of this earthen wall, they built a wooden palisade, a fence of sharpened stakes. They built watchtowers at the corners and fortified gates. This was not a temporary marching camp. It was a semi-permanent fortress, a base of operations. From this secure position at Fulham, the Vikings could dominate the surrounding countryside. Einar spent the winter there. During the day, he would be part of a raiding party that fanned out into Surrey or Middlesex, gathering food, plunder, and slaves. They would travel light and fast, knowing they had a safe place to return to. At night, they were safe behind their ditch and palisade, protected from any surprise attack by the local English forces. These fortified camps, sometimes called long forts, were a critical part of their strategy, especially for the large armies of the later Viking Age. They were not just defensive, they were offensive tools. A well-placed camp could blockade a river, control a trade route, or serve as a launching point for a season of raiding. The Anglo-Saxons under King Alfred learned how effective these forts were and began to copy the idea. Alfred started a program of building his own fortified towns, known as burhs. He realized he couldn't beat the Vikings in a mobile war. He needed to create a network of strong points that could protect the population and from which his army could operate. It became a war of fortifications. The Vikings were masters of siegecraft as well. When they encountered a walled town, they used a variety of methods to take it. In 885, a huge Viking army besieged Paris. They built siege towers, used battering rams, and tried to undermine the walls by digging tunnels. The siege lasted for almost a year. Although they ultimately failed to take the city by storm, they caused so much damage and disruption that the Frankish king paid them a massive tribute to leave. Einar saw the value of both building and destroying forts. At Fulham, the fort protected him. On a raid, he might be part of a group trying to storm a small English burh. They would use ladders made on the spot. They would use fire to try and burn wooden gates. They were opportunistic, using whatever tactics seemed likely to work. The image of the Viking as a sea raider who only fought in open battles is incomplete. They were also military engineers. They understood the strategic importance of holding ground. Their ability to quickly construct effective fortifications in enemy territory allowed their armies to survive for years, slowly strangling the kingdoms they sought to conquer. Their camps were not just places to sleep, they were anchors that allowed them to moor themselves deep inside a hostile land. Number one individual prowess was the foundation of the army. Rolf was not a jarl or a king. He was a free farmer from a small village in western Norway, but he was also a warrior. His status in the village, his honor, was tied directly to his skill with weapons and his courage in a fight. In the long dark winters, when there was no farm work to be done, he did not rest. He practiced. He would spend hours in the snow-covered yard behind his longhouse. He practiced with his spear, throwing it at a wooden target until he could hit a spot the size of a man's head from 50 paces. He practiced with his shield, learning to block blows from every angle, his arm and shoulder growing strong from the weight. He sparred with his neighbors, using blunt wooden weapons. They fought hard, and the loser would have to buy the ale. His most prized possession was his sword. It was an expensive weapon, the blade made of pattern-welded steel, a sign of wealth and status. He cared for it meticulously, he kept the edge sharp and the steel oiled. A sword was not just a tool, it was an extension of the man. To be a skilled swordsman was a source of immense pride. This focus on individual martial skill was the bedrock of Viking Age combat. While they fought in formations like the shield wall, these formations were made up of individuals who were expected to be highly competent fighters in their own right. A shield wall was a collection of one-on-one fights, all happening at the same time. The success of the wall depended on the ability of each man to hold his own space to defeat the man in front of him. If a gap appeared in the wall, it was up to the men nearby to close it. If a warrior was isolated, he had to be able to survive against multiple opponents until help arrived. There was no room for passengers in a Viking army. Every man was expected to pull his weight. In the year 881, Rolf joined a raid on the continent. They fought a Frankish army at the Battle of Secourt and Vimy. The battle went badly for the Vikings. The Franks, led by King Louis III, were well organized and fought fiercely. The Viking shield wall was broken. The battle dissolved into a series of scattered, desperate skirmishes. Rolf found himself cut off with 2 other Norsemen. They were surrounded by 5 Frankish spearmen. There was no formation to hide in, there was no jarl to give orders, there was only the fight. Rolf and his companions formed a small triangle, back to back, a tiny impromptu shield wall. The Franks jabbed at them with their spears. Rolf used his shield to parry one thrust, then stepped in close and used his sword to cut the spear shaft in 2. He fought with a cold, focused calm that came from years of practice. He was not just a farmer, he was a trained killer. They managed to fight their way out of the encirclement, rejoining a larger group of their comrades. They lost the battle that day and were forced to retreat, but Rolf had survived. His personal skill, honed over years of relentless practice, had kept him alive when the army's grand tactics had failed. This is the final secret. The Viking army was not just a system of tactics and strategies, it was a collection of dangerous individuals. Their society celebrated the warrior. Their stories, the sagas, were about the great deeds of individual heroes. This culture produced men who were self-reliant, aggressive, and highly skilled in personal combat. When all else failed, when the shield wall broke, when the element of surprise was lost, when the commander fell, the outcome of a battle often rested on the simple, brutal question of whether one man was better with his weapons than the man trying to kill him. For Rolf and thousands like him, the answer, forged in the cold Norwegian winters, was often yes.